I'm Michael Pulilאב, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Let me begin by saying it is always interesting in Israel. It is never boring to be in Israel. It's wonderful to be here. I flew in on Sunday from Bangkok on El Al, and I was on the last El Al flight to go the long way around. And when I go back, we will fly the direct route via Oman. So, Mazel Tov, it's about time. Let me say, I'm honored to be here today at the invitation of the chairman of INSS, who is also the chairman of the Lowy Institute, Frank Lowy. I've been associated with Frank and his family for 21 years. He asked me to write the feasibility study for the Lowy Institute. I've been the director for the last 10 years. I'm honored that he is not only my boss, but my mentor and my friend. So let me say at the beginning to Frank, to David, to Margot, Toda Rabah. Today, Manuel and Timar have put on a fabulous conference. I look forward to listening to it and to learning from all the brilliant speakers. I look forward to experiencing Israeli democracy and Israeli free speech and Israeli wisdom. At this panel, we have a dream team of people to talk to us about the global situation. I know there'll be a lot of discussion of the region and the domestic issues. Today, we're going to focus on the global issues, but I promise you we will come back and discuss some of the implications for Israel. We have a dream team of Dan Shapiro, the former US ambassador to Israel, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from Tsinghua University in the PRC, Ambassador Eric Dannot from France, and Andrei Kozyrev, the former Russian foreign minister. Welcome, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, there is certainly a lot to talk about on the global stage. We are still emerging from a pandemic that has claimed 7 million souls and seized up the machinery of globalization. We are 1 year into the unprovoked, unjustified, brutal invasion of Ukraine by its neighbor, Russia. But thanks to Ukrainians' courage and ingenuity, Russia has not prevailed. US-China competition is heating up, and it is squeezing countries like Australia. Every day, the liberal international order seems a bit less liberal, a bit less international, a bit less orderly. The global economy is troubled, and all the while, of course, the planet continues to heat up. So these are some of the issues we want to
במקביל לכל
discuss.
הדברים הללו,
We have
כמובן שכדור הארץ ממשיך להתחמם.
45
אלו הנושאים
minutes,
שנרצה לדון בהם. יש
so
לנו
we're going to be very
45
disciplined.
דקות
I know you
לרשותנו, אז
think that
אנחנו נהיה
Australians are
מאוד
very laid
ממושמעים.
back,
אני
but
יודעת
today
שאתם חושבים
you're going to see a
שהאוסטרלים
ruthless
הם
Australian.
מאוד נינוחים, אבל אתם תראו היום אוסטרלי קשוח
So let's
במיוחד.
get straight to
אז
the meat,
בואו
ladies and gentlemen. I want to talk about, there's going to be a round of questions on Ukraine. Let me start with you, Andre. How would you characterize the current balance of forces in the war against Russia-Ukraine? And what does it mean for Putin? So far, from my perspective, it has been a strategic disaster. In most countries, this would be unsurvivable for a leader. Will Putin survive Ukraine?
If I may start also echoing you, like I am proud and honored to be here, and I am particularly envious of Israel through all my life, because it's a new state, it's fast developing and vibrant democracy, and I am envious today. The organizers were warning me from yesterday that there will be disruption by the demonstrations, rallies on the streets. But that makes me envious. That's something long forgotten in Russia, rallies. democracy, free democracy, the people expressing themselves. And that's important to answer your question. First of all, it's dictatorship. It goes back and back in time. It, in many aspects, resembles now Stalin's dictatorship. And that's why it becomes more and more aggressive internationally. So the war in Ukraine is the product and the only reason for this war is dictatorship in Russia, and this dictatorship tries to find legitimization of its being in power. Putin is in power for 23 years, and he still blames a government I belonged in early 90s for difficulties, but he had plenty of time to correct the situation. He made it worse internally and externally, so to say, internationally. So the only reason for the war is dictatorship in Russia. This war can continue for a long time. It's a war of attrition, and Putin might be winning this war as we speak because he has advantage of the cannon fodder, that is manpower, which he can give to the front in thousands, probably even in million people. And because of dictatorship, he has advantage of internal propaganda, which is overwhelming, and the Russian people is under the influence of this propaganda. And he has advantage of economy, which might go on this primitive, rather Soviet-like level of technological development for a long time. So that's why he might sit there for long with the war of attrition. And the termination of the war, especially speedy termination of the war, is also possible, but that depends exclusively on NATO and America if they give advanced weapons, because that's the advantage of the West, technological development. In the West, I include Australia, of course.
Toda. Dan Shapiro, let me bring you in. Andre was maybe a little pessimistic, perhaps, about the chances in the long term. He mentioned some of Putin's strengths. From my perspective, the United States has played a blinder in the last year, providing funds, intelligence, material, intelligence, quarterbacking the West. How optimistic or pessimistic do you feel about the war? And secondly, I asked Andre about Putin. Tell us what you think about the role of Zelensky in leading his country. What does that tell us about the role of individuals in international politics? Dan.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and it's wonderful to be back home at INSS, so thank you to Frank and the Lowy family and to Manu and the team and to all my colleagues here. I'm not sure if I'll land in optimism or pessimism about the war, but I will, I think, pay tribute to the determination that, first of all, you referenced President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people have demonstrated. Certainly during the early days of the war, or even in the run-up unto the war, there was a very real fear, and it was voiced even in Washington, that Russia would be successful in decapitating the Ukrainian government, in seizing the capital, in forcing Zelensky and his government into exile if they would survive at all. And obviously we have seen something completely opposite of that. We have seen the Russian military bogged down. We have seen the Ukrainians fight valiantly. We have seen Zelensky rise to represent his people, but also become kind of an international statesperson for the rights of a country to defend itself from a brutal and unjustified invasion. And so there's a lot of optimism that can be drawn from that, even while we know that this may be a very, very long and difficult slog. But the other element of the determination, and you referenced it as well, I think goes to President Biden, goes to the U.S. administration, it goes to the NATO alliance and the broader international community as well, that has drawn a line in the sand that said there is no acceptable outcome in which Russia does not lose this war. Now, exactly what the final endpoint looks like, exactly what the determination of any negotiation between Ukraine and Russia would mean on the ground, that's obviously a decision only the Ukrainian people and their government can make. But the rallying of the international community, the funds, the military training, the military equipment, the intelligence, and really the solidarity, I think that now one sees as leaders of many countries, including most recently President Biden, stream to Kyiv, as President Zelensky is free and able to travel to visit other capitals and other leaders, is a signal that the international community, certainly the community of democratic nations, has stood together and sees what the stakes are. That this is not your average regional war. This is a war of great global strategic importance, and its outcome is of great global strategic importance. And I'll just add one more point before I stop, which is that this war, of course, also has created dilemmas for Israel. Israel, for perfectly understandable reasons, has sought to sustain some form of dialogue with Russia, some form of deconfliction of its need to attack Iranian assets and Iranian positions and military equipment that streams into Russia, streamed to Syria, very much under Syrian Russian protection. And that's been important. But it has also been important for Israel to know where it stands in that global orientation around this war. And it does, I believe more can be done to demonstrate this, stand with the democratic community of nations, defending and helping a country defend its right to exist and to resist this kind of brutal invasion. I think there has been steps to increase that form of Israeli demonstration of that position. I think more yet can be done in terms of weapons, in terms of intelligence, in terms of sanctions against Russia, in terms of the articulation of that positioning.
Thank you, Dan. Jawbor, you tell us how you would characterize the current balance of forces between Russia and Ukraine. And let's talk about how the war should end. Dan just said that from the Western point of view, there is no acceptable outcome for this war, except one in which Russia loses. Give us a Chinese perspective on that, because of course China has recently put forward some principles for peace. Bo.
Thank you, Michael. Nowadays, being a Chinese, you feel almost flattered whenever people throw out questions one after another on China's role, which has nothing to do really with China. And this example about the war in Ukraine, China is not informed, China did not participate, and China certainly has not provided any assistance, as Anthony Blinken has claimed. But still, people talking about China's role. Which side will you take? Could you become a serious mediator, or would you even attack Taiwan? And I believe this is the price of China being a major power. Then on this issue, China is caught between Russia, its strategic partner, and Ukraine, that takes China as its largest trading partner. So China was very careful in walking on the tightrope. So our position is not that explicit when we talk about the respect of sovereignty, but which could not be misunderstood, because this clearly tells that this is the invasion of one country against another. Right now, China has proposed a new peace proposal. Doesn't matter, because right now there are so many proposals, and there's no guarantee that China's proposal would be accepted by by the warring parties. But I believe China has an advantage in that China has a good relationship with Russia. So if Russia wants to listen to anybody, probably Russia will listen to China more. And over there, what is China's role? China's role may be that de facto leader of the six-party talks. That is basically about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which I doubt. Or maybe it is just an equal participant, like in the Iranian nuclear issue, in which China is only a participant. But I believe China really could play a positive role in that. Do not believe that China has not given out a timed roadmap. The Chinese, I believe, are good at finding the road without maps. I'll give you two examples. In the last 40 years, China has shaken off poverty of 800 million people without a roadmap. And 10 years ago, we put forward the Belt and Road Initiative without a roadmap. Now, this Belt and Road Initiative is a name very much familiar with any part of the world. So this is Chinese way of doing things, and there is no doubt about China's sincerity in making peace as early as possible, because this will really hurt us. We are not standing behind. This hurt us. This hurt China's Belt and Road Initiative. It hurts China's relationship with European countries, because China's relationship with the United States is becoming more and more, intensified with rivalry. Therefore, it is in China's best interest to keep good relationship with the rest of the world. But don't forget one thing, the global south. Here we talk about how the West think about the world, but don't forget the global south. Global south is the majority of the countries around the world. And in global south, China, India, and South Africa refuse to take sides. And most of the countries would refuse to take sides. Thank you.
I want to ask the ambassador about the Global South, but let me just ask one quick follow-up, Bo, if I may. You mentioned China is walking a tightrope, and it's balancing its relationship with its strategic partner, Russia, but also Ukraine, which is important to China. But for many decades, Chinese interlocutors have told me about the central importance of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. And there's no more egregious violation of state sovereignty and territorial integrity than one powerful country invading its neighbour. So isn't it time perhaps for more clarity from Beijing on the importance of state sovereignty and territorial integrity for Ukraine?
I think Chinese State Councillor, who is a top diplomat in China, Mr. Wang Yi, actually talked more about respect of sovereignty at the Munich Security Conference. Given that China is not a country that is unified, I'm talking about Taiwan issue, therefore you understand how China would respect this concept of sovereignty. But China does have some sympathies with Russia in that we know how this war actually came about. You see, when a murder occurred, people just started investigation. But the murder itself was planned a long time ago. This war basically is a result of NATO's expansion. And all the Russian leaders, starting from the Soviet Union, ever since Mikhail Gorbachev down to Boris Yeltsin and President Putin, have all invariably warned against the NATO expansion. And what makes Putin different? Putin is different from his predecessor in that he not only gave warning, but he carried it into action. Now people talk about the casualties. On site, that is fully understood. But without understanding the root causes of the war, the security in Europe can never be resolved. Let me put it in a very simple way. You know, I know how NATO is becoming popular with the entry of Sweden and Finland. If you say NATO is popular, I fully agree. If you say NATO didn't force anyone to enter NATO, I fully agree. But there is one thing. The security of Europe eventually lies in compromise between Russia and NATO. If there is no compromise, the more popular NATO is, the more insecure Europe will become. Sadly, that will be the fact.
All right. Ambassador Danoon, first of all, let me give you an opportunity to respond to what Bo said. Is this war NATO's fault? Is it the result of NATO's expansion?
Thank you for your invitation, and thank you to the board of INSS. This one is better. Yeah.
You see, we're compromising.
Yes,
we're
it's
sharing.
a compromise with
peace
China.
plan,
You know.
Peace plan.
Yeah. I will answer, but first about the balance of power. Let's say first that Russia has lost all this war in all the non-military aspects of the war. That means a wake-up call for Europe and putting NATO back on track with the new legitimacy. And he lost because he wanted to reintegrate Ukraine. He has now 44 million people hating him. You know, and it will be very difficult for the future. For all. And we could add, he made Zelensky a world hero in terms of patriotism. So they lost. But now, of course, there is the military aspect. And this, we can say, first that it is the ancient way, the Soviet way to make war. You know, with this reservoir of people for the army, you know, sending thousands and thousands of people. This is the old way, I should say. C'est une guerre de régression. And we see the tanks, for instance, the war has totally changed. With javelin and drones, you can stop the old Russian tanks, etc. The war itself has changed and has lost to, in the world, I would say, in the communication war, but this with nuances. So at the end of it, my personal conviction is that Russians are going to lose the war because they are losing their mind. Because the narrative, the basic narrative, and then I come back to your question, about denazification of Ukraine, about NATO and the pressure of NATO to make war to Russia, etc., was totally wrong. And that's why this war cannot be won by the Russians. Now, maybe it cannot be lost. And nobody has a clue of what is going on in the next months and years. Probably we'll have a Russian offensive in the coming weeks and months, then a counter-offensive from Ukraine, a kind of stabilization of the line, and then we'll see. Nobody has a clue. Okay. Is it the fault of NATO? Profoundly, no. But something happened. In 89 and 90, we said, orally, unfortunately, nothing has been written, that some countries of the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, will not adhere to NATO. And I can say it personally, I was in the room at that moment as in the staff of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it has been said to Gorbachev very clearly. But I wrote it, and it is in the archives somewhere. But what happened 10 years after the Bucharest summit? Open bar for newcomers, NATO. And so I can understand the reaction of Russia at that time. Okay. But that does not mean that this is the reason to go back to a kind of Cold War and to say that NATO has a responsibility in this war. Profoundly, I don't think so. But there is a possibility to put the story in the narrative of Putin, saying that the Western countries have lied, etc., about NATO, etc. I can hear that, but profoundly, I personally think that we have no responsibility, and the narrative of Putin about the Western Bloc wanted to defeat Russia, etc., no. The real narrative is that he wanted to go back to Ukraine, take Ukraine, and that's all.
Okay, one more quick question on Ukraine, and I want to ask about some other issues. Ambassador, tell us about you mentioned before that the war has given a new legitimacy for NATO. Tell us, as a European, what has it done to the solidarity and social cohesion, words we heard last night in relation to Israel, solidarity in Europe, but also address Bo's good point, which is that although Europeans and Western and like-minded countries feel very strong on this, there are whole swaths of the world that we have not convinced, including the global south.
No, you're perfectly right. You have this double effect, I should say. In Europe, it was a wake-up call, and we began with the sanctions, and then very rapidly we came to, for the first time, the European Union has paid for arms and weaponry to go to Ukraine. It's the first time we have paid for that, billions of euros, and it is less than the US, but it is important, and not only symbolically. This gave Europe an opportunity to make concrete things for an external war, and it's the first time. Then, will that lead to a new organization? I'm not sure that, but it led to a new kind of cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And this was, I should say, indispensable. And now we are working really in a good cooperation team and system. And war clarifies and simplifies things. And now we know who is the enemy. And now it became much clearer than before. Now, on the global south, no, we have to do a lot of work about that, and this is about communication, once again, fake news, Wagner, etc., but it's something else.
All right. You put a very sharp question then, who is the enemy? So, Dan, let me come to you. I won't use the word enemy because enemy is a very heavy word, but let me use the word rival. Who is the United States' chief rival at the moment in this new paradigm? Is it Russia or is it China?
I'm not sure we need to identify a chief rival. What the United States obviously seeks to do is to stabilize and strengthen the liberal international order that has prevailed over many decades. It is under stresses. You identified them: economic stresses, climate stresses, of course, the stresses of an aggressive Russia in Europe. But what the United States, I think, seeks to do is to find ways of ensuring stability, even when there are rivalries. And that we don't need to hide from or pretend are not the case. Clearly, the United States and Russia, unfortunately, are now in a much more adversarial relationship by Russia's choice. And again, by Russia's choice, the United States, therefore, has no choice but to rally its NATO allies and others to ensure that Russia loses this war. The United States and China are competitors. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think we all acknowledge that. And they can be competitors for influence. They can be competitors economically. But they can also, and do also, find means and opportunities to cooperate on shared priorities, whether it is climate change, whether it is in trade. And certainly, even if we don't always define the terms exactly the same way, in those principles of sovereignty and inviolability of borders and things that actually we both speak about, even when we sometimes mean different things. Do we need to be prepared? And one always should be prepared for all scenarios, for deterioration of a U.S.-China rivalry into something more combative. Of course, one needs to be prepared for every scenario. I don't think anything that I have seen suggests the United States seeks that kind of confrontational relationship with China. But again, being honest and being open among friends, clearly the United States and China will compete for influence. We will at times find that our interests are not aligned. And when that happens, hopefully, as the Secretary of State and his Chinese counterpart met in Munich, they find the means to dialogue to de-escalate tensions. But clearly, things like aggressive moves against Taiwan would cause very significant stresses in that relationship. Things like surveillance balloons over the United States mainland cause stresses in that relationship. It may be that there are actions the United States takes with its Indo-Pacific allies that China views as causing stresses in that relationship. So there will be stresses. As long as we keep the means of dialogue open, hopefully we can manage them, and at least from the United States perspective, manage them within the framework of that broader international order.
All right, Zhao, how would you characterize the US-China relationship at the moment? From my perspective, in the months since the Party Congress, China has softened its stances on a number of issues and relations have improved with a number of countries around the world, including Australia. That was one of the reasons I found the spy balloon drama that Dan Shapiro mentioned a bit puzzling. It seemed like funny timing to send that kind of balloon over the United States. Explain the balloon situation to a confused Australian, and tell me how you would characterize US-China competition.
Well, since you are confused, that tells exactly why it is not necessarily a spy balloon. And why would send
not necessarily a spy balloon.
Not necessarily, it was big spy balloon. Why should we send a big balloon that is as large as 3 trucks flying so slowly over the United States, knowing that it would be detected, knowing that now satellites can do all the things? Why should we do that? This is a good question for everybody. Yeah. And then talking about the China-US relationship. I think the problem is that the United States really has lost some confidence vis-a-vis a growing China. And the problem of China is only that it is growing, and it's growing so fast. What have we done? We're not exporting our ideology. Yeah, we are developing fast, but we're not, having war in the last 40 years with anybody. And you never have such example of a rising power, rising so peacefully. Yes, you can mention that China had deadly brawl with India along the line of actual control, but which, costing 20 soldiers' life on the Indian side and 4 Chinese soldiers' life on Chinese side, is actually a deadly brawl. We did not shoot at each other. So apart from these, you can hardly give me another example of China have been, killing anyone or evading anyone. So the word coming from the United States that China is aggressive, is coercive, well, it's probably the only word that they can use to describe China. Then about the future of China-US, China hopes that this is a relationship basically of cooperation. We know there is, of course, element of competition, but still, which makes you feeling safer? Cooperation or competition? It is the United States which believes this is a competitive relationship. And my hope is, in spite of the elements of both, cooperation could still prevail over competition. This now probably sounds like a wishful thinking. But in the worst case, I believe on this we have some common agreement not to have this kind of competition slide into confrontation. That is the joint good wish. The problem is we don't know how to do it. Because President Biden talked about guardrails, to secure this relationship, and China talks about confidence building measures. The problem is the strength of China militarily is not as strong as that of the United States. But in the Western Pacific, our gap of strength is closing. So that makes this situation very complicated, and there are so many economic interactions between us. This makes this relationship more complicated.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to cooperate on getting through a lot of questions, so thank you, Zhao. Let me ask you one more question, but from now on I'm going to ask people to keep their responses to just a minute or two, because we've got about 10 minutes to go and I want to get through a few issues. Zhao, let me ask you about the pandemic. How did the pandemic change international politics from your position, and do you think China's handling of the pandemic strengthened or weakened China's international position?
In human history, pandemic has actually killed more people than all the wars combined. So human beings live with pandemic and eventually coexist with pandemic. China is not experienced with this kind of pandemic control, so we just try in our own ways. In the beginning, we are very successful, but we eventually find that the pathogen really knows no border. So we could have made mistakes like everybody else. So that's why we need to learn from each other, and we need to have international cooperation on addressing these common issues.
All right. Andre, we've talked about the Russia-Ukraine war. We've talked about US-China competition. Let me ask you about China-Russia relations. Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping proclaimed a no-limits partnership. From your position as a former foreign minister, how would you characterize the strength of this partnership? Is it strong? Is it resilient? Some people say it's a new axis. Some people say China is the big brother now and Russia is the little brother. What are your thoughts on the Russia-China relationship?
Sorry. I take pride in establishing initially the new Russia-China relationship because in the end of the Soviet Union there was still ideological connection, that is communism and all that. I offered the Chinese leadership at that time a simple idea of a good neighbor relationship because we have longest probably in the world land frontier, land border, and a lot of things to cooperate as two big powers or great powers. And I kind of expected China to grow, and it did, and I am happy with that. And I think that for Russia, it's very important to keep the good neighbor relationship, but when the Putin's government tries to establish this big brother, small brother, or whatever, engage China in access, that's detrimental to Russia, against Russian national interests, and that's definitely against Chinese national interests. And I rely on the wisdom of the Chinese. I knew I had, I will dare to say, friendly relationship with Jiang Zemin, late head of China, and he was very, very balanced and very wise leader. And I hope that the Chinese leadership would be too wise to engage in this anti-American, anti-Western alliance with this crazy Putin's regime. I would like to remind, though, people here that the Budapest Memorandum, which I handwrote partly at that time, yes, it was initially signed by the United States, Russia, and Great Britain, but China and France, they also adhered to this memorandum officially very soon, just in few days after the memorandum was signed. So China has a responsibility, like all other participants, in protecting Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity as it was at that time, that is internationally recognized, and to protect Ukraine, especially from threats, any kind of threats, from nuclear power, which Russia is certainly. And finally, what I like to mention that for the United States, for the West, China is a competitor. Russia is an enemy of the international order, as you said, They commit, as we speak, aggression, which is crime against international order recognized by every country, including China. China is, like the United States, is permanent member of the Security Council and the custodian of this international law. So it's not the problem of democracy protection and everything. We like democracy protection. Probably some people don't or formulate it differently. But the international law is very clearly written in the book. That is UN Charter. And Security Council members in particular have special responsibility to sustain this order. Thank you so much.
All right, we have 2 or 3 minutes left. I want to ask one final question, so I'll give everybody 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds each to answer this question. The great American international relations theorist George Kennan, who came up with the idea of containment back in the day, he wrote a classic book called American Diplomacy. And in that book, he quoted an African proverb: "When elephants fight, the grass gets trampled." Now, Australia is a small country, so we're down there in the grass. Maybe Israel is in the grass too, a little bit, if you'll allow me. So my question to each of these, we have so much wisdom on the stage today. In 30 or 45 seconds, what is your one piece of advice to Israel? When the elephants are fighting, how can countries like Israel prevent themselves from getting trampled? How can they navigate their way through this great power competition we've described? So let me go in the opposite direction. Let me start with you, Andre.
My answer is don't agree to be a grass. You are not grass. Israel, for one, is fantastic country. Eastern European countries joined NATO on their own will. They earned it. Even Poland and Hungary at that time, first participants, they, for 6 years, 8 to 8 years, were working to meet the criteria. So none of them was invaded to become NATO. NATO, it is not NATO expansion. It is countries want to join NATO, like today Sweden and Finland. And those countries were not former Soviet-dominated countries. They were new democracies by themselves. Australia is not grass. Australia is fantastic country. That's the one I missed all the time. I never come to Australia because it's too far away. Either from Russia, where I was foreign minister, or from the United States, where I live today. But that's the point. No grass.
No grass.
Independent countries.
Very good. All right, Ambassador Dannone. Let's say not grass, but how do smaller countries prevent themselves from getting trampled?
Come on. Okay. Always Chinese save me. Okay. 2, 3 things. First, Israel.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Israel is a fantastic country which finds its own way to become now a regional power, and maybe it will be more one day once the local issues, I mean particularly the Palestinian issues, is fixed. Second, never be against a great power. In the US, of course, or Russia, or China. When you are a small country, you can't afford to be against one of the superpowers. And now you have this extraordinary relationship with the United States. Perfect. I think that's the right situation. Third, as Israel is becoming more than a regional power. I mean, with the Abraham Accords, etc. This comes with great responsibilities, and I think that Israel could do more, for instance, with Ukraine in terms of implication, including weaponry.
Thank you. Bo.
Jewish people are considered to be the most clever people in the world. And you are also American allies. So put these two together. My wish, coming from Chinese, is that use your brain when Americans ask you to take their sides. Do not always take American side without thinking. Think about your own principles, think about your own interest, and decide on each specific issues, not just taking side blindly. Thank you.
Done.
I think there is great understanding in the United States that Israel, as a small regional power, has to maintain reasonable and functional relationships with all countries, and certainly with other global powers that have roles in the Middle East in particular, and that obviously applies to both Russia and China. And so there is great understanding about that. And at the same time, the United States, which provides extraordinary support for Israel in military terms and security terms and diplomatic terms at the United Nations in many other ways, and does so because it's in the United States' interest, not only and not primarily for any altruistic motive, but when called upon to ensure that U.S. interests, core interests, are protected, Israel should be prepared to respond. Israel wants to be firmly in the camp of liberal democratic countries that uphold that international order. Israel benefits from American leadership that is represented by that coalition. And so when core U.S. interests are at stake, and the United States and Israel have the kind of intimate dialogue that we're always capable of, it's important that Israel take very close account of what those interests are.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had 4 pieces of very succinct advice from 4 very wise people. I've tried to keep my own opinions out of this discussion, but let me say I did like the way that Andre rejected the premise of the question completely and said that countries like Australia and Israel are not in the grass. So let me perhaps say I agree with Andre. I think Israel is a great country, like Australia is a great country. All of us want to live all of us want our place in the sun. None of us want to live in the shade of big countries around us. All of us want to make our own sovereign decisions. All of us can contribute with our values to the world, can make a difference to make the world, the region, a better place. So I hope that Israel, like Australia, thinks big. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I have learned a lot from these 4 gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen, for being succinct, for being funny, for being interesting and informed. Congratulations to INSS and onwards and upwards. Thank you very much. Toda rabba.